Hello and welcome to Phoenix Talent Talks in partnership with The Business Post. The topic of this, our third episode, is diversity and inclusion. I'm Elaine O'Regan, I'm a journalist at The Business Post, and I'm joined here today by Ruth Lyndon, Managing Partner at Phoenix, Stephanie Good, Senior Manager and D&I Lead, People and Organisation Consulting at PwC Ireland, Caoimhe Clarkin, Head of Litigation and Regulatory at DLA Piper, and Sheelagh Daly, Entrepreneurship Manager at Enterprise Ireland. So we do have an all-female panel today, and I think it's important to say at the outset that although gender balance is a very important element of diversity and inclusion in any workplace, it's not the full picture. So on that note, Stephanie, I'm going to start with you because I know diversity and inclusion is something you're quite passionate about. How do you define it?
Well, actually, that's a question that I often ask clients when I talk to them about diversity and inclusion. I'll ask them, what does it mean for you? And it's really interesting. I'd say 9 times out of 10, people immediately start talking about gender. And I think that's a really understandable thing for organisations, because when they look at their own organisations and they look at the dimensions of diversity that are visible, gender is obviously right up there. And I'm a really strong supporter of action on gender diversity and representation. But I do encourage clients to go a bit broader. And the reason for that is I think there's 3 real reasons to look at it more broadly. It's more in keeping with the spirit of the topic. I think you run the possibility of having the unintended consequence of, I suppose, disengaging some people if you define your diversity in terms of gender only. I think you get greater buy-in if you look at diversity from a broader perspective. And I would see this with clients. When I talk about ageism, for example, you often see a lot of men in the room nod their heads and you see, okay, that's really getting them engaged in the topic. And I think there's also the risk that you run if you too closely associate your D&I efforts with gender, that once your gender statistics start to improve, that the organisation thinks you're done. And I think it's quite difficult to go back and start that conversation again to say, can we have another discussion about diversity? So I encourage organisations to go broader than the 9 grounds covered by equality legislation, because I think that we should be looking at some other topics like socioeconomic background, which isn't covered by that. And I would say also, it doesn't preclude you by defining diversity broadly from prioritising your actions. So I've seen clients very effectively look at a broad strategy on diversity and inclusion where they look at, say, one client looked at 5 pillars, but they did prioritise gender. They did work on everything, but they put a little bit more effort into gender because gender was particularly important for them. So I think broader is better. I think also when we talk about diversity and inclusion, improving diversity as a phrase, there's some research out there that's quite interesting, which suggests that if we talk about reducing homogeneity, that actually gets greater buy-in than the term improving diversity. And I've seen that in practice as well. It's been quite effective.
Why do you think that is?
I think the phrase diversity, in some instances, people have quite a negative view of that. And I think when you talk about reducing homogeneity, it brings people's mind to the fact that perhaps our organisation actually is quite homogenous. When you look at Ireland, Ireland is increasingly multicultural. We're really changing as a society. And ideally, when you talk about diversity, what we're trying to achieve is a more representative workforce in your organisation, something that represents the country and probably your customers as well.
Caoimhe, diversity and inclusion is a priority for DLA Piper, but what does it mean for you as a company and what steps have you taken to promote it?
It is absolutely, Elaine. It's a key priority. So DLA Piper is a global law firm with lawyers and staff in more than 40 countries. So the Dublin office has this wonderful advantage of being able to leverage and foster the different backgrounds of the people that we now have the opportunity to work with around the world and also in Dublin, whether they're our clients or our colleagues. Like what Stephanie's saying, our clients justifiably expect us to offer both talented and diverse teams. Our client base is multinational with people and products all over the world. And what we want to do is to support this and to provide a workforce that mirrors that community. Having a diverse workforce, what does it do? Well, it helps us to access new markets, to develop broader, deeper relationships and also to deliver exceptional service. But actually, more importantly, and for me and for DLA Piper, the key objective is that we create that culture that Stephanie was talking about, that culture of inclusion where everyone belongs, everyone's voice counts, everyone can bring their whole self to work, that they're confident. Like, that is so important, that people are confident so that they can fulfil their full potential. Our D&I strategy, and it's exactly what Stephanie was saying, it's so much broader than gender. We focus on gender, sexual orientation and identity, nationality and culture, social mobility, which focuses on people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and also ability, focusing on people who traditionally may have been held back by different physical or mental abilities.
So what does DLA Piper do to approach this in a way that really works?
So rather than focusing on the numbers or the statistics, our strategy focuses on inclusion, and it's inclusion in action, building on our firm's values. So our firm's values are to be bold, to be exceptional, but to be collaborative and to be supportive, and that is really, really important for us. So what do we want to achieve really? It's that balanced workforce with a balanced leadership, and then by balanced we mean a leadership with a mix of all those strands. People in these groups or strands have clearly faced both perceived and also real barriers. They're factors that mean that individuals have actually ruled themselves out from entering the legal profession. So we work with external groups and we work with universities to improve access generally to the legal profession. Myself and Ruth were talking, one example is our very own wonderful associate Chris Murnan. He's on the committee of Outlaw. Outlaw is a network that brings LGBT plus individuals and allies working in the Irish legal sector together to discuss and to promote the Irish legal sector as a destination of choice for LGBT plus individuals, which is fantastic. From DLA Piper's perspective, we want students and undergrads of all backgrounds and different disciplines as well to consider a career in law generally, and also be confident that they won't face those barriers that we all know exist because of who they actually are. Like, even when you say it, it can't be that people feel that they can't progress because of who they are. We want to attract and retain, but also to empower people from all aspects of life to strive in an environment where they're actually given the tools. So you have to be a little bit more proactive. You have to give them the tools to feel that they can fulfil their full potential.
What are the tools you've introduced at DLA Piper to help make this happen?
We have our own internal people groups. We've got Iris, our LGBT plus group. We've got Law, our Leadership Alliance for Women. They have developed fantastic and proactive initiatives to encourage networking opportunities, working with clients on opportunities, encouraging the sharing of ideas globally, and also really just celebrating some events throughout the year that we all know about, like Pride, International Women's Day, which are actually important, and it's a really nice opportunity to come together internally to do that. One thing I would say is we have structures. We have policies in place for each of these strands that are really important, because what they do is they actually increase accountability for outcomes. Now, that is actually important. But statistics and numbers can only go so far. Quotas, for example, are not the answer. What they do is they've the potential to undermine those talented individuals who could have and should have been promoted based on merit. Tokenism, you've heard, is equally ineffectual, and it actually can hinder that quality of service that we really are, trying to achieve and ensuring that we achieve. We've all discussed the fact that there is no silver bullet, but if there is a silver bullet, it's authenticity. Genuinely engaging with your workforce to ensure that everyone, as I said, has the confidence to be themselves, but to speak out and to challenge and to engage in those conversations. If you have an open and fair culture, the conversations are actually endless, and if you put them into action, they can achieve amazing results. So the commitment to inclusion, which I think is actually the key for a D&I strategy, it can't ever falter. You need to achieve an inclusive culture before you can actually genuinely attract and retain a talented and diverse workforce. If you do attract a diverse workforce, you then have to retain that talent, and then you need to empower them to have the confidence to fulfil their potential. It's really important for us. It's very exciting. We're actually seeing a shift in what's regarded as a successful business, and DLA Piper is a different kind of firm. They are looking at this shift and they're recognising it internally. There's a genuine desire to recognise and identify and overcome biases, and that is absolutely key, and then you can harness that talent and create that positive environment.
Ruth, as a recruiter, you have a direct line to candidates, so you'll have a sense of what they want from employers. From your own experience, what does diversity and inclusion actually mean to them?
Well, first and foremost, I would say that this is, increasingly on the radar for candidates, which is a positive thing. Indeed, when I'm discussing opportunities with candidates, I will actually explicitly discuss or disclose, the D&I policies and cultures and values that a company has in play, because it is increasingly important. In terms of what does D&I mean for employees, at the end of the day, employees want to work in a company and a culture where they're respected for who they are and the value they can bring, and also where the pathways to success are transparent. In terms of then what do they expect of employers, I would say to a large extent, and understandably, they are influenced by what they're experiencing in their current employer or maybe a past employer, or even more so, people are much more in tune with this and they're maybe looking at, I want to work for DLA Piper because I can see I've done my homework, I've done my research, I love what they're about. So candidates are coming into processes much more informed. In terms of what this means in reality, what can employers do? For example, I would say that candidates absolutely expect that first and foremost, the recruitment process is to be diverse, fair, transparent. So from making sure that the people who are actually interviewing, have the relevant training, whether it's unconscious bias training that I know the likes of PwC carry out, also to make sure that the panel is diverse. This can go a very long way if it is, a female sitting there, for example, and if, she is sitting across from a person panel and it's all male, this can have an influence. And also, importantly, and you would be surprised how often employers don't hit the mark in this regard, the ability to talk convincingly and knowingly about their own firm's D&I policies. And that's where very quickly a candidate's going to see, is this just lip service or is this genuinely coming from the top down? So I think the recruitment process and the interview process first and foremost, then I would say things like agile working and flexible working. That is now becoming, the norm. It's not the exception to the rule. And it, enables both parents with children to feel included and valued in their workforce, but also you can have, for example, people who maybe are, semi-professional sports players or have some other activity outside of the workplace that takes them away from work, but they want their employer to recognise the value that brings, and they also want to feel included. I would also say clear career pathways is key, that it's very visible. This is the process. There's no discrimination. There's no barriers, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, etc. That this is a free for all, for everyone. That's really important as well. And then I think, policies and procedures, so that there maybe is a D&I committee. So a candidate knows, again, it's not just lip service. There actually is a dedicated committee in this organisation and they get to influence the policies and procedures. So this is coming from the top down, and this organisation actually values this. It's putting resources behind it, and it's looking at how it operates as a business with a D&I focus.
So Stephanie, I'll bring you in there. From the point of view of employers, what practical steps do you think they can take to ensure that their workplace genuinely supports diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I think clients often really struggle to take their ambition and turn it into action. I think it's very hard for organisations sometimes to know where to start, and it can feel quite overwhelming for them. And the first thing I'd say is it is possible to make real inroads into improving diversity and inclusion in your organisation. Don't worry too much about what the multinational tech company down the road is doing. It's about what's right for your company. It has to be what's right for your situation, for your culture. There's three things that I think every company needs when they start looking at diversity and inclusion. The first is leadership support. Ruth spoke about this earlier, about the top-down approach, and I think that's really important. I think the leadership in an organisation sets the tone. They really influence the culture. You need leaders to be bought into the topic. You need them to visibly advocate for D&I. They need to prioritise it, they need to put their time and energy into it. And when they do that, they're very visibly signalling to their own direct reports and other management in the organisation that this is an important topic. It's a business priority. It's not something that sits with HR and is a nice fluffy thing to do. It's a nice to have. This is absolutely business critical. You need them to role model the right behaviours as well. And Caoimhe spoke very well about the inclusive environment in her organisation and the behaviours people display there. You also need leadership support for resources. I think it's something you absolutely need to look at. You need to look at whether you have people or you have the budget in order to put your D&I plans into action. I've seen a lot of resistance in organisations when it comes to D&I because people do buy into the topic, but they're often asked to take on D&I responsibilities in addition to their day jobs. And as most of us are, very busy, that can be a cause of resistance, and that can sometimes be misinterpreted as we're not interested in D&I and it's just that people are too busy. So leadership is really important, and accountability, and Caoimhe spoke about that as well in terms of DLA Piper. What I've seen in practice that works really well is to have D&I owned by an accountable executive, to have it be in their performance goals for the year. In one organisation I worked with, the CEO and everybody in their team had D&I as a goal for the year, and they were measured on it on a regular basis. Really important. One of the other things that's really important for organisations is data. So you need to understand where you are now. It's really easy for organisations to make assumptions about what is the issue in their organisation. And I would say PwC struggled with this, as much as anybody. When we started our diversity journey internationally about 15 years ago, we had an assumption that the reason we didn't have more women at the senior levels was because women went on maternity leave. But actually, when we did some really rigorous data analytics, what we saw was that we had women at younger ages and more junior levels leaving the organisation before they started families. So it wasn't anything to do with having a family. What actually was happening was when we hired to replace men and women, we were hiring men exclusively. So the solution we had to come up with was obviously quite different there than perhaps looking at a return to work for women who'd been on maternity leave, which some organisations look at. So data is really important. It's something that organisations struggle with. Poor data quality or availability of data is something that I see with clients all of the time, but most organisations will have some data. It might be quite basic, it could be gender and age only, but start from what you have, understand what the data is telling you, what is the actual issue in your organisation, because there's a real risk that you can focus your energies on the wrong thing and then your diversity and inclusion doesn't improve, and then people say it's not working. So really understanding what the issue is. The best approach really is to put a D&I lens on what you already do. So we heard earlier mention of reviewing policies and procedures. D&I is something that should be embedded in all your HR policies and practices, and also the kind of behaviour and culture. We've spoken about that as well. The last thing I'd say organisations need is a strategy and a plan. I think that's really important because you'll have diverse views about D&I, ironically, in management teams. And I've seen this, and actually creating a strategy helps to surface some of those views and get agreement around the table of actually what do we mean when we say diversity and inclusion? What are we prioritising? What are we going to do about it? I think it's really important to have a plan that's time-bound, to have targets. I'm not talking about quotas necessarily, but to have some kind of targets. And I think where organisations often fall down is communicating that. So think about your stakeholders. You may have a slightly different message for your board than you have for your employees, but organisations are often doing quite good jobs at actually addressing diversity and inclusion, but not a very good job at communicating that to their employees. And that's really important to show that you're taking practical steps. I think what you do then beyond that is really dependent on what the issues are in your organisation. I've seen some really good practices out there in Irish firms. So I would say to organisations, look at what's happening in the marketplace, but be careful about benchmarking. I think there's a tendency to think we'll do everything that all these other companies are doing, but it really, as I said at the start, has to be bespoke to your organisation. The last thing I'd say is don't lose sight of your employee voice. I think when we look at data, it's quite easy to take a very quantitative approach, and it's really, I think, important to ask employees what is their lived experience of being in this organisation. And I think that's really important for lots of reasons. I think stories are very compelling for people when you're trying to get buy-in. But I also think it's really empowering for employees. If you're part of an underrepresented group in an organisation, how empowering would it be for your line manager to say to you, Stephanie, tell me what it's like to be part of this organisation as a woman or as a disabled person. I think that's something that's often missing from the conversation we talk about D&I, because D&I can be seen as a negative, but actually we heard a very compelling story about DLA Piper and what it's like to work there. And I think back to the communication piece, if organisations could do a little bit of a better job in saying, this is what it's going to be like to work here when we're more diverse. And I myself have worked in an organisation that had 92 different nationalities in one office. And it was an amazing place to work. It was so creative. It was so energetic. The organisation really valued the diversity that was within the office. And it was just a lovely place to be. And I think that's something we often miss when we talk about the business case for D&I, because we're very busy talking about the impact on the bottom line and other benefits. But actually the benefits for your employees are multiple.
Caoimhe, I'd like to bring you in there to look specifically at gender balance, because we do know that attrition can be a problem for firms as their female employees progress further up the career ladder. What's your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely, Elaine. Gender balance has that added layer of complexity. It requires a unique focus, as perversely law firms tend to have a balanced representation of lawyers at junior level, or indeed significantly higher proportion of females, but this changes drastically at partnership level. So the question is, how do you actually redress it? At Daly Piper, and as I've said, and Stephanie mentioned, we said gender balance at leadership remains a key focus, and therefore we need targeted interventions to ensure that we retain the amazing and wonderful talent that we have, and to further increase representation of women at senior levels for lawyers and for the wider business services population, which is integral to the success of any law firm. What these targeted interventions look like is tricky. As Ruth said, no one size fits all. People are different, and people are leaving for different reasons. So what can we do? Stephanie mentioned every employee has a voice, and that is absolutely key. By engaging with individuals, by understanding and identifying the barriers to progression, by giving people the time and space to navigate around those barriers, by focusing on removing bias. Proactive initiatives include unconscious, or as some people call it, sometimes conscious bias training, mentoring, sponsorship, the setting of real and achievable goals. And achievable goals is absolutely key. We may need to look at the criteria for partnership, and also whether there are unique senior roles for individuals, both male and female, who for one reason or another are not considering partnership at that time but might do so at a later time. You know, what we say is we're interested in people for the long run, and it's a long career for them, and we need to help them along that journey. Women at a certain level are leaving private practice for roles which are equally as challenging, but they have a different emphasis on presenteeism. You know, people can be more agile and flexible, as Ruth was saying. It's two key words. And it's not difficult. At Daly Piper, agile and flexible working is encouraged at all levels. It's not gender specific. People have children, parents, sporting commitments, as Ruth said. It's crucial that these people can balance those priorities in life by recognising that sometimes those priorities actually shift. People need to focus on one priority over another at any given time, and they actually shouldn't have to change. As a junior lawyer, I was lucky enough actually to have a senior partner who constantly encouraged me to identify, to develop my strengths, which he recognised were actually different to his. And that's important. He pulled me along with them at various stages in my career. That gave me the confidence and the desire to at least explore my potential. You hear too many times, sometimes women need to push a little bit more. That's just not the answer. We need to empower women. We need to nurture their talent and their potential, and we need to give them the tools, or there needs to be tools, that they can have control over a fulfilling and an enjoyable career, and that is already a successful career.
On that point, Sheelagh, Enterprise Ireland has sort of taken on the same supportive role, but in a broader context. You recently launched a 6-year strategy aimed at supporting women in business. Tell us about the thinking behind it.
Yes, well, Enterprise Ireland is the government agency that responsible for supporting and encouraging Irish enterprises to scale on international markets. And as part of that, we also invest in a small number of high potential startups every year, around 100 high potential startups. So a number of years ago, our focus was on increasing the number of female founders involved in high potential startups, because the number was very low. We were talking about 7 out of the 100 included a woman. So we put in place a number of measures and put a spotlight on that issue, and we were very successful in terms of achieving a trebling, in fact, the number of female founders involved in our HPSUs, up to 21% last year. But last year we also decided, look, we can't continue to expect something to improve if we just keep looking at this particular cohort. And we, looking at the statistics, looking at the fact that there is still 3 times as many men starting businesses as women in Ireland starting and growing businesses. Clearly, as the National Enterprise Agency, we decided, look, we have a role in trying to influence, taking a broader view and trying to really accelerate the pace of change. For many, many reasons, one obvious one being the significant economic potential of if you can realise more women achieving their potential and starting and growing new businesses. So the outcome of all of the research that we did over the past year to develop this new strategy is that we have now nailed our colours to the mast. We have 4 core objectives that we are working towards over the next 6 years. Each of them is a standalone objective, but critically, they are interconnected, and to achieve one, we have to achieve all of them. So we will continue to keep a focus on increasing the number of female founders involved in high potential startups. But we also want to increase the number of women-led companies that are scaling on international markets. We want to increase the number of women who are becoming entrepreneurs, and which is quite a significant departure for us is that we want to see an increase in the number of women in leadership positions in Irish companies. And the reason for that, a lot of that has been spoken about here, but I suppose from our perspective, there are 2 driving reasons for us to actually make that a core objective. One is that we know from all of the international research and statistics that having increased gender diversity in senior strategic leadership and decision-making roles actually has a very significant impact on company performance. It improves profitability, it increases productivity, it increases return on assets. So our role is to help Irish businesses to be the best that they can be. Therefore, given this overwhelming evidence, clearly we want to drive and encourage and support Irish businesses to increase the level of gender diversity in their senior decision-making roles. The second reason for us having this specific objective is that we know people who have senior management experience in an industry sector are much more likely, first of all, to see an opportunity for an innovative new enterprise, and secondly, are more likely to have the confidence and self-belief in their own capability and skills to actually do something about that opportunity. In addition to which, and very importantly, particularly for women, they're more likely to have access to those really important networks of connections that you really need, particularly when you're trying to start up a business. So those are the 2 underlying driving reasons why we have that as one of our 4 key objectives in trying to accelerate the pace of change and increase the number of women starting and growing and scaling businesses in Ireland.
So Ruth, we've heard here today already some really strong arguments in favour of encouraging diversity and inclusion in the workplace and in business in general. Do you find, however, that some employers still treat this topic as something fluffy?
Thankfully, I would say that the tide is turning. Whilst this is, as we've mentioned today, this is relatively new. Nobody has this completely sussed yet. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. But in my experience, employers are increasingly focusing on D&I and in a meaningful way. I think there's a number of reasons why. First and foremost, they are recognising and seeing that this has a positive impact on, first of all, its staff, both attracting and retaining its staff. And the employers, are using this in a beneficial way to showcase why good talent should come to them. I think also, as Sheelagh mentioned, it is proven time and time again that a gender diverse workforce will have a positive impact on profitability, productivity and return on assets. Also, employers are looking around and looking at their competitors, and they're seeing that, okay, these guys are clearly showcasing what they're doing on the D&I front, and it's yielding very positive results from a talent perspective. So the tide is turning. I think people are talking about it, employers are talking about it in a more meaningful way. And I think because they see, okay, this is going to have a positive impact on my staff, on my business's culture, and ultimately on productivity and the bottom line. So in addition to things we've spoken about already, like the agile working and maybe the D&I specific, committees and training, some interesting initiatives that I've seen would be, for example, one client, they provide training to managers who have staff coming back from maternity leave, because there are very specific challenges that any mother faces coming back from maternity leave. So they're actually empowering their senior management and leadership team to be able to deal with that. that. Another client recently mentioned that they actually send their IT team out to every employee who wants it. They will send them out to their house to make sure that they are set up and feel comfortable to work remotely. And then there's also, really good initiatives like Caoimhe mentioned, the Outlaw Network, also things like the 30% Club, membership of that. There's also things like the Trinity Access Programme and the DCU Access Programme. Again, Caoimhe have mentioned those. So these are all really positive initiatives, and employers are increasingly showcasing this, whether it's, in very clever means. Social media is really being used a lot more by employers. If you go to an event or you're sponsoring an event, you tag, you go to it, you tag at it, you tweet from it. So the likes of LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, these are all really powerful tools that employers are using to showcase the positive D&I policies. But we're not there yet. As I say, no one company has this completely sussed. It is an ongoing work in progress. But I'm really positive from, being on the cold front and talking to employers day in, day out. I am definitely seeing a shift, and I'm seeing a meaningful shift, which I'm really positive about.
So that's it for today's podcast. I'd like to thank all of our panel members here today, Ruth, Stephanie, Caoimhe and Sheelagh. Thank you all for listening, and we'll be back again soon with our next Phoenix Talent Talks podcast. Phoenix is a leading specialist search firm focused on the professional services sector, specialising in functional and senior level appointments in accounting, advisory and legal firms. They're expert consultants who are professionally qualified or have experience in global advisory firms, use technology-driven, enhanced search capabilities to attract and engage top talent.